to extend a special welcome to those of you who may be attending a Gender and Sexuality Studies event for the first time. We're delighted to have you here. It's really nice to see so many students. It's my special privilege and pleasure to welcome our speaker for today, Enke, Professor of History, Gender and Women's Studies, and LGBTQ+ Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Professor Enke is also a graphic artist whose work, as you can see, will figure centrally in their lecture for today, which is entitled Starting Where You Are, a graphic exploration of Transfeminist Histories and Contemporary Practice. We're especially glad that Finn is able to join us because October has been declared Queer and Trans Empowerment Month at Northwestern. In a few moments, I'll have a few more things to say about Professor Enke's transfeminist scholarship and activism, but first I would need to thank a number of people who have made this lecture possible. First, as always in Gender Studies of GSS, I want to acknowledge the support of the Edith Krieger-Wolf Endowment for underwriting this lecture. The Edith Krieger-Wolf Endowment was established in 1973 by Chicago philanthropist Edith Krieger-Wolf in collaboration with her daughters, both of whom were MU alums. The fund was originally designed to address the dearth of women in positions of authority in American universities by bringing to Northwestern scholars, professionals, and public speakers who could deepen students' familiarity with the contributions women have made to scholarship, to the arts, to public service, and to the professions. As a result, the foresight and generosity of the Krieger-Wolf family provided substantial support, important support, first to Northwestern's Women's Studies program, then to Gender Studies as it was renamed, and now to Gender and Sexuality Studies. As our thinking about gender and sexuality has changed over the years, it's been possible to extend and enlarge the purview of the endowment to support all kinds of work related to gender and sexuality studies throughout the university. My thanks to Dean Ann Bradlow and those before her who have made this extension possible. Additionally, I want to thank Elliot Collin, who is GSS Program Assistant. Elliot is somewhere here. There's Elliot. Thank you for everything involved in arranging Professor Enke's visit, including designing the excellent flyer for today's lecture. Finally, thanks to all of you for coming. I know how insanely busy everybody is at the beginning of a new year and a new quarter, so it's great to have you here and to have your participation and support. All of you are invited to a reception after Professor Enke's lecture to continue the conversation. I should note as well that Professor Enke will be meeting with students tomorrow at a lunchtime seminar for grad students at noon in the GSS seminar room, which is 1525 Kresge, and lunch will be provided. And finally, Finn will also give remarks at the opening of the exhibition titled Lavender Women and Killer Dykes at the Gerberhardt Library and Archives at 7 p.m. this Saturday, October 12th. The library, if you haven't been there, is located at 6500 North Clark between Pratt and Devon in Rogers Park. And it looks to be a really good exhibit. As I said, it's a great privilege and personal pleasure to welcome Finn Enke to Northwestern. I first met Finn many years ago as a graduate student in history at an event organized by I think it was the American Studies program at Minnesota. Since then, I followed Finn's career with interest and have been inspired by the challenging political and epistemological issues they have addressed in their scholarly writing. Recently, I was surprised and delighted to learn of the ways in which Finn has pursued these concerns in graphic prints, pastels, and drawings, some of which you will get to see today. Finn received a BA with distinction in Religious Studies and Asian Studies at Swarthmore College, and then continued on, first in Comparative Studies in Discourse and Society, and then in history at the University of Minnesota, where Finn completed an MA and a PhD. First hired at Wisconsin in 2001, I think it was, yeah, Professor Enke has taught there ever since and has been awarded both the Chancellor's Distinguished Teaching Award and the History Department's Dorothy and Sing-Nung Yao Award for Outstanding Teaching of Undergraduates. There are many ways to characterize Professor Enke's rich interdisciplinary scholarship at the intersection of feminist studies, sexuality studies, and transgender studies. But the feature that has always stood out for me is the rigorous way in which that work weaves together a historian's perspective and deep respect for change, together with dedicated attention to less recognized, often uncanonized, dissident actors and supposedly minor actions and events, which have nonetheless had an impact on history's trajectory. This was evident in Professor Enke's first book, the wonderful Finding the Movement, Sexuality, Contested Space, and Feminist Activism, which was published by Duke University Press in 2007. Based on extensive research into on-the-ground feminist movement activism in various cities throughout the 1960s and 70s, including Minneapolis and Chicago, Finn demonstrates not only that feminism was neither unified theoretically nor driven solely by ideology, but rather defined and pushed forward by a range of different activists who labored always locally and therefore within particular contexts, where laws, zoning rights, neighborhoods, architecture, and transportation interacted with and affected the pragmatic political aims of the many people who are trying to define what feminism might be and could become. The book tells a nuanced story about how feminism actually happened in the streets, in collectives and groups, in bookstores, coffee houses, and a range of different social spaces, and how the interactions there privileged some sexual, class, and racial identities over others. What makes this book so special is its ability to hold differences and debates in tension with affinities and collaborations. Professor Enke then continued this work in the already much cited article, Collective Memory in the Transfeminist 1970s, Toward a Less Plausible History, which was published only last year in Transgender Quarterly. It's a great article. With its focus on the complexities and ambiguities of lived experiences, with an emphasis always on the plural, and the multivocal and multivalent nuances of early forms of feminist movement, this article makes a strong case for a feminist history that might attend carefully to the mixings and traces of change, to a feminism that's not as unified or wasn't as unified and as coherent as we might have once thought, that actually contained within it what Finn calls, quote, a potentially lifelong trans history, end quote. Finally, Finn Enke has continued their important work in another well-regarded volume, Transfeminist Perspectives in and Beyond Transgender, or in and Beyond Transgender and Gender Studies, and is it Transfeminist? No, it's Transfeminist and Gender Studies, an edited collection which Temple published in 2012. This book was the winner of the 25th Annual Lambda Literary Award for the best book in transgender nonfiction. Bringing together a range of essays by both well-known and emerging transgender studies scholars, Finn's book critiques the constricting tendencies of both disciplinary and identitarian investments, suggesting even more strongly than previously that trans perspectives might be central, not marginal, to gender and women's studies. The essays explore the different epistemology at the heart of transgender studies, an epistemology that attends to processes, fluidities, mixings, and crossings, rather than to stabilized categories, objects, and norms. Finn's own essay in the volume, The Education of Little Cis, Cisgender, and the Discipline of Opposing Bodies, explores the rhetorical and discursive history of the category cisgender, demonstrating that however well-intentioned the creation and deployment of the category, in the academic context where it's been taken up, it often inadvertently encourages investments in a gender stability that undermines feminist, trans, queer, and related movements. And it often does so by failing to pay attention to the multiple hierarchies on which cis status depends, including those founded upon class, race, national, and ableist distinctions. I hope you can see from these two short remarks that Finn Enke's work is courageous, it's consequential, and searching in the very best sense. Would you join me then in welcoming Finn Enke to Northwestern?
Hello, everybody. Can everybody hear me okay? Great. If that changes, please let me know, raise your hand, and I can make adjustments. I want to thank you all for being here. It's really exciting for me to be here with this audience, and I want to thank Jan for having me, and Elliot for doing a lot of arranging and dealing with technology, and Scott for escorting me over to this building. It really is a fantastic opportunity for me to be here. It has allowed me to put together some different aspects of my work into a single talk. So we'll see how that goes, bringing together some graphic work, as Jan said, and also some of my historical work. And Jan, I want to also thank you for your generous and eloquent remarks, and especially for finding a through line in my work. Yeah, that was really So yeah, as I said, this is bringing together some works from my graphic memoir and also some historical reflection. I'll talk a little bit more about the graphic memoir about midway through this. What you're seeing, I will show some images prior to that, and those are from that work. They are accompanying the introduction to the talk and some of the history to the talk. So as Jan mentioned, this is called Starting Where We Are, a graphic exploration of transfeminist histories and contemporary practice. I'm sorry, your transgender is hard for me to get used to. It's just that when I met you, you gave such a strong image. I saw you as such a strong feminist. And I remember you had a long braid and just a very different picture. Quote unquote. Upon recently receiving this confession from a colleague in gender studies, I spun out a bit, trying to figure out what's not adding up, historically speaking. I've worked with this colleague since 2001. I used to have a braid. I started to come out as transgender after I got tenure in 2007. I used to be a strong feminist. Lost in the tangle of a presumably true past and an incoherent present, I missed my cue to say whatever one ought say in such circumstances. It wasn't the first time anyone's integrity seemed to depend on connecting not only legible but also likable dots across time, according to agreed upon logics. And that might be why I became a historian. How do we story the past? How do we story the future? How do we story the present? My lean into history was also motivated by my own upbringing. The screen is telling me something that it's not telling you, and I don't know what it means. Thank you, Elliot. Okay, thank you. My lean into history was also motivated by my upbringing in the movements of the 50s, or excuse me, of the 60s and 70s. Running from tear gas at the age of 5, at the age of 7, at the age of 9 demands reflection. And school reports. But more than tear gas, the most formative aspect of participating in those movements as a child was the feeling of thousands, tens of thousands of people, or sometimes just a handful of people, using their voices because they had to. This is the caption underneath says, "A cop car ran over this lady's hand." And here, my mom is trying to take me and my brother to pick up my dad to go to a protest, and the cop says, "Man, you need to turn around now." And she says, "Oh, you just go to hell." And I remember it so vividly, it was terrifying. Even if things would not change soon or enough, our voices, by no means unified, told us that in that moment, fascism had not won. This is just more of that. Our disparate voices meant that there would always be infinite ways to tell a story and describe life itself. And the caption, whoops, the caption on this one says, "The people had guitars, the cops had tear gas. The cops are people, so they also had gas masks." That is to say, our various cables to rage, to use Audre Lorde's phrase, were not just cries into a hoped-for future, but bulletins that we are here right now. Eloquent or not, we are here. This moment is also that moment. And I think it's not even possible to send a cable anymore. But do people even know what a cable is? Yeah, I'm not sure. Anyway, so it was a former way of sending messages. But rage finds channels. And our practice of creating what is needed begins exactly where we are, listening for the multiplicity of ways of being. As a historian, I reflect on uses of the past to register present-day desires. So getting back to that recent moment when my absent braid signaled the loss of my feminist strength, what can my colleague's pronouncement tell me about her hopes and fears, her conceptual world, that my present articulation as transgender and unbraided is irreconcilable with her first perception of me as woman and feminist? Historians must grapple with all kinds of emotional and social investments, including our own, to make sense of our archive. So in this talk, I want to offer a transfeminist reflection on mostly the 60s and 70s. And my intention here isn't so much to create a record of transfeminism in those decades, as I've done in some other works, but rather, what I want to do is to consider the ways that our always changing lenses can illuminate the dynamic qualities of what might be considered gendery signs, and then suggest that we go beyond them. So I'm going to look at 3 different moments that themselves reflected on feminist pasts. One comes from the mid-1990s when I was in graduate school and preparing to write a dissertation about feminist activism in the 60s and 70s. Another comes from my graphic memoir of childhood in those decades, in which my own marks on the page sought to create alternatives to the experience of extinction. And the third, with which I began, starts with our present moment. I want to open up consideration of the ways we do, in fact, articulate things that are illegible and illegal. If we understand language as an agreed-upon sign system, it seems clear to me that we are always saying things that language does not allow, things for which there are no words, communicating far more than will ever be admitted, permitted, or reflected back. We do it anyway, as though our lives and life itself depend on it. What happens, for example, when we take seriously a child's fascination with category crossing? So some have said that fascination is about developmental stages and learning the rules and which one of these things doesn't belong here and that. But we know it's not just that, in part because the insistence on transformation usually comes after the rules have been comprehended. It says, the dolphin named Finn and the seagull named Jay got married. They lived happily ever after. And this isn't simply category crossing. What if we took seriously the possibility that the child is challenging those categorical distinctions at the deepest existential level, potentially articulating a transformative practice of recognition, interdependence, and interbeing? This one says, one day Jay said to Finn, "Finn, call me Flower." Finn said, "Okay, Flower." They went for a walk on the beach, played in the water, watched the sunset. One day, Flower died. Finn was very sad. He went back in the ocean and married a turtle. When I started graduate study in feminist and queer history in the early 90s, it seemed as though the definition of historical feminist activism was undergoing major transformation, as it always must. My peers and I read works by feminists of color in the global North and South who advanced post-colonial and critical race theories that offered a feminism framed by and as struggles for sovereignty and self-determination, abolition, decolonization, and queerness. They thereby offered a highly interventionist sense of how feminism got here and what it could mean. In the 90s, transgender studies was not yet a field in its own right, but feminist, queer, subaltern, and critical race studies provided tools to recognize that binary refuting people were visible everywhere across place and time, including deep within the heart of feminism's many incarnations. They also compelled us to ask what these kinds of queerness had to do with colonial and white supremacist violences in the past and present. I remember how impatient my peers and I were for someone to write a more gender-inflected biography of Polly Murray. And somebody has. Murray's treatises of Jane Crow offered provocative analyses of the violences required to create not only racial segregation, but also binary gender. For Murray, race and gender violences were inseparable. Perhaps few audiences then, in the 90s, comprehended Murray's insistence that the violence of gender segregation, that is, binary distinction, starts with forcing people to stay put in a single legible gender not of their own making. As historians Rosalind Rosenberg and Simon Fisher have recently put forth, it was no mere figure of speech when Murray told Harvard Law School, quote, "I would gladly change my sex, but since the way has not yet been revealed to me." We must ask, was Murray's critical gender analysis and inclination, quote, toward the male side, incidental to, a short-lived aspect of, or fully integral to Murray's contributions as a Black feminist? And must we resolve Murray's gender struggles as a woman's response to sexism? Or might we retain Murray's own more challenging articulation of non-binary race and gender in a context of mutually constitutive racism, sexism, homophobia, and transphobia? I put our old questions in the present tense because some people still fear what happens to women's history when we bring a more dynamic, less binary lens to human navigations of social life. To what extent can we focus on gender instabilities before we're talking less to feminist history and more to trans history? If a story, possibly inadvertently, becomes trans history, does it leave feminist history behind? Or can it illuminate a potential that's always inherent in the subject of woman, women, and feminism? Conscious and unconscious decisions about who are the proper subjects of feminist history continue to shape our scholarly environments at every level, from hiring and retention to whether students dare ask us to use their correct pronouns. So Audre Lorde was neither the first nor the last to wonder about attachment to the master's tools and whether we can pause and put them down. How fascinating then when two books came out on post-World War II queer communities in Buffalo, New York. They were Liz Kennedy and Madeline Davis's Boots of Leather, Slippers of Gold, The History of Lesbian Community, and Leslie Feinberg's Stone Butch Blues. So this was 1993. We watched avidly as audiences categorized these books in contrasting ways. And even at the time, many of us intuited from a certain tension that this was a turning point, and that something we would eventually come to call transgender history might emerge out of then still young lesbian history. Boots of Leather, Slippers of Gold, and if you haven't read it, I highly recommend it. It's rooted in a really impressive set of oral histories that granted interview subjects a great deal of space on the page. Also discussions of queer sex and sexuality that were at the time unprecedented in academic works, especially history. The book unquestionably told a working and middle class, mostly white, lesbian history. It illuminated the forms of activism required to withstand homophobic and sexist violences and sustain butch and femme lives in the 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s. Actions and resistances that the authors suggest we see as proto-feminist. Simultaneously, Leslie Feinberg's autobiographical novel offered a dramatically different perspective on queer Buffalo, bringing readers still more intimately into the passions, places, and gender diversities of sex and queerness, and more viscerally into the violences of capitalism, racism, criminalization, homophobia, and transphobia. It was impossible to miss the near consensus around the categorization of Boots of Leather as a lesbian history, and the lack of such consensus about Stone Butch Blues. Many celebrated Feinberg's work, Stone Butch Blues, as a path-breaking working class lesbian narrative, while others insisted that it was a purposefully transgender narrative. Some boldly suggested that the relative class, race, and gender privilege of most of the narrators in Boots of Leather might be what segregated lesbian, butch, and femme lives in that book from the far more precarious, transgender, economically marginal, and not always white embodiments articulated by Stone Butch Blues. It became clear that the present moment, the pertinent story of that moment, or the tension of that moment, was unfolding in three related registers. We had to acknowledge the intense historical marginalization of trans people and people of color in Buffalo and the US broadly. We could also see their historical marginalization from emerging predominantly white lesbian and feminist communities. And most critically to us at that moment, we faced the near illegibility of historical transness in contemporary academic discussions. For her part, Leslie Feinberg in the early 90s was busy creating language for a growing transgender liberation on the streets, in labor halls, at the earliest Camp Trans events, and in the midst of Gay Pride and Queer Nation. Feinberg identified at that time as a transgender lesbian, feminist, and communist, and explained here, her, his pronouns as contextual, each differently useful. Feinberg also articulated butch as a gender, sometimes distinct from woman, even as butch often took formation within lesbian as well as more mixed genderqueer communities. The confluence of these two path-breaking books provided an important hint that, historically speaking, some butches might have been women, and some might not have been, even among lesbians. This is an insight that may come as a still slowly dawning surprise to some, but for many, the existence of numerous trans and non-binary genders was a long-standing and obvious reality awaiting more language and enough collective value to speak itself to broader audiences. As a grad student, I began to wonder about the investments that made it possible to call either book lesbian history, without seeing that it was simultaneously something tangible enough to name transgender history. I started thinking about the 60s and 70s again recently when an acquaintance named Barb repeatedly referred to me as she until another member of the conversation offered, "Finn's correct pronouns are they or he." Barb responded, "Oh yeah, actually I knew that. I did know that. It's just that we didn't have those things when I was growing up." Barb is a year older than I am. So probably not hiding my surprise, I allowed as to how we didn't have those things when I was growing up either. But I later wondered which things we didn't have when we were growing up. Pronouns? People whose gender is not obvious. People who correct others when they make pronoun mistakes. Efforts to make language more inclusive. All these things we had. Transgender and gender crossing and non-binary people always being in the wrong bathroom. Marginalized people seeking an increased ability to exist in social space. These things have also been around pretty much since the beginning of time. So what was it like to grow up when transness apparently could hardly be spoken for lack of language? This is one of the questions I explore in my memoir, With Fin and Wing, Growing Up Amphibious in a Nuclear Age. It begins in 1969 when I was 5, and the Indiana and Michigan Power Company started construction on a twin reactor nuclear power plant half a mile from my family home on Lake Michigan. I grew up in a white family committed to social activism. We were almost always demonstrating, writing letters, and boycotting. Our attentions to the farm workers and ongoing civil rights movements, punctuated by participation in massive anti-war protests at Michigan State University. My mother, a social worker and feminist, made sure that my brothers and I, even in grade school, understood contraception as well as conception. Gay and lesbian liberation were very immediate and visible in my childhood, as was quite a dose of bullying. As my family struggled with mental illness and disability, shoreline devastation sent nearby houses toppling over the dunes into the lake I loved. And I was busy both articulating and protecting my soul with life and death all around me. So when I started this project, I thought my question was, what does disappearing look like? I was, particularly by puberty, going underground. But I soon discovered that the story was not exactly one of disappearance, but prolific, if often secret, expression that included and dramatically exceeded gender. So, to give you a little bit of context for the memoir, it literally consists of pages like this. The pages are modeled on art and school assignments, journal entries, letters, other markings that I created as a child. And those, along with my own and others' memories and archived documents, provide a record on events and also provide a record for my handwriting, my vocabularies, my sometimes intentional misspellings, my drawing styles, my sensibilities. So the book is as though drawn and written by a child who both is and is not the child I was. In thinking about this, here's where I'm bringing maybe a few different genres together, but thinking about this as transfeminist method, I'm interested in what kid art can tell us about the logics of the 1970s. And I should say that's not in this presentation, but my pages are full of hippies who gave me so much life and sense of possibility when I was young, mostly for breaking rules. So I really am interested in what that art can tell us about the logics of the 70s and what was present in the violences and the possibilities. But I also want to consider the ways that visual material, and maybe especially kid art, skirting the bounds of what is and is not allowed off the page, can make us more aware of what we as readers are and are not yet ready to admit. So another question might be, what does it look like to know the violence is in our midst and to respond anyway to the bids for connection? So I'm going to show you just a really small sample that these are from 69 to 74, and this ends in 75. The whole book ends in 75, so I'm 5 to 10 years old, roughly. This is A names or A letters. Abraham, Andrew, ask, orangutan, ants, armadillo. Mommy doesn't like the name Spot. See Spot, run, 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 Spot. Spot's running off the dog. He hate his clothes he has to wear. This is, so my parents had a lot of art books, and I made really good use of them, especially when, not always when I was mad, but you know, sometimes. Anyway, this is Rembrandt, and it's Margaretha de Geer, but I interpreted this person as male and as pretty unhappy. And with good reason. Dear Lake Michigan, do you care what kind of bathing suit I wear? I didn't think so. Ha ha, I want to wear cutoffs. And that overly exposed green thing under there says, but I don't have any. So my family sometimes would go to a monastery by the name of St. Gregory's Abbey in Three Rivers, Michigan. And I developed a friendship with one of the young monks there by the name of Brother Peter, who would draw these really interesting, weird creatures, and I think that's probably how we ended up connecting, because there just weren't really a lot of rules about how those creatures turned out, and I think we connected around that sort of thing. So this is a letter to Brother Peter. Dear Brother Peter, here's a story on the paper you loaned me. I had fun visiting the Abbey. You can keep this. Once upon a time, there was a kitten named Otter. All the other kittens said, "Are you a girl or a boy?" Otter said, "I'm a kitten." Everyone always said, "What are you going to be when you grow up?" Otter said, "I don't know, probably a cat or a dog." Everyone laughed. But then one tiny kitten said, "Me too," and then they became friends. P.S. When did you know you wanted to be a monk? And here's the first of. So some of you may not have been exposed, I'm guessing, to this assignment, but every single January came with the assignment to talk about what we would be doing in the year 2000, if we were lucky enough to make it that far. And so this is in 1971. I'm in first grade. My teacher's hand is on the paper, making some corrections there. And I'm answering a set of questions that can be intuited. 37 years old, 2, sailboat. I think that's where am I going to live. 3, mustache striped shirt. I have no idea what that's answering. 4, monk or writer or teacher. 5, play guitar and hockey. 6, lots of animals. Cats, dogs, butterflies, fireflies, lizards, frogs, toads, dolphins, turtles, seagulls, lions, bunny, bears, elephants, zebras, crickets, grasshoppers, deers, caterpillars, praying mantis, giraffes, birds, snakes, monkeys, tigers, dinosaurs, come back. Kangaroos. Possibly in response to the teacher's intervention on my name there, he has big purple teeth and a big bicep. So this next set is from a set of stories that are called Stories by an Aardvark. And it goes on for a while, but I'm going to pull just one of the stories out of there. And this is the first page that starts that. One day, all the animals sued the people. Your nuclear power plant is killing us. They hooked up the animals to a lie detector test. The animals are telling the truth. We don't care. We will nuclear bomb them tomorrow. Overnight, all the animals turned into giant pterodactyls with sharp teeth and claws. The human people got scared. Even their cats and dogs turned into pterodactyls. Everywhere, so many pterodactyls with sharp teeth and claws. The human people got in their spaceship and left to find another planet. The next night, all the animals turned back into themselves. First, we will take apart the bombs and nuclear power plants. Bye-bye, human people. The end. Question, weren't there any humans left? Answer, I have to think about that. Okay, the human beings on the spaceship started fighting before they even got there. Finally, they landed. Let's build nuclear power and bombs in case Martians want our things. No matter where they went, humans were killing things and each other. The animals on Earth were happy, but then we are nervous, but we have to tell you, we are actually animals inside. I'm sorry, we are actually humans inside. Why didn't you leave on the spaceship? And the animals who are human inside said, the nuclear humans hate us because we live like animals. We didn't want to go with them anyway. Okay, then we can all live here together. No war, no polluting, love Earth, everything, the end. Dear Brother Peter, I hope I can go to the Abbey soon. I was wondering, how old do you have to be a monk? Tell Father Leo I can work in the garden at the Abbey. P.S. The Abbey should get monkey bars. Ha ha, get it? Dear Lake Michigan, how are you? I am eating lunch, then I will bring you this. I'm not going to put it in a bottle or litter it in you. We are fighting the I&M because they are polluting you, taking away your dunes, and all the houses are falling into you. Our house might fall in, too. Radiation can last almost forever. I love you. I am going swimming. In you now. Love, a human. I do not have curly hair. Dear Brother Peter, thank you for putting wings on the dolphins I drew. I just added mountains, so now they are flying over the mountains. It is snowing here today. P.S. I heard you have to be a boy to be a monk. Is that true? P.S. Was everyone at the Abbey always a boy? Everyone wears robes, so what difference does it make? Here are some more at night. So these are not in, they're in order, but I just selected many of them out. This one, so my teachers were constantly frustrated with my inability to use a pencil and my insistence on using a pen. And I found it really uncomfortable to use a pencil, so I just pretty much never did. And they were always telling me to use a pencil. But here, it is not a law, it's just a rule that you have to use a pencil at school. Mrs. Bratzel said, okay, I can use a pen. This is a school report that I'm writing on a subject of my choice, which is law. A lot of things are against the law. What does that mean? Do not pretend to be someone else. You can get thrown in jail. Or if you get caught running away to Canada because you were against the war. My dad had to take a lie detector test because someone else broke the law and said it was my dad. Pop said my dad should stop looking like a hippie. Pop is my mom's father, my grandpa, he's a lawyer, but it is not against the law to look like a hippie. Here's a lie detector test asking, are you a hippie? And the human says, maybe. And the lie detector says, yes or no only, you are or you are not. There's just sort of a persistent, now I'm finally allowed to use a pen and I have to put the writing sideways on the paper, that we don't even use that kind of paper by that point in school. So, and as if that wasn't enough, it was really great to get my hands on St. Gregory's Abbey stationery. And I did a lot with it. Tuesday, the 4th day of March. Dear Mrs. Bratzel and Principal Schwartz, this letter is informing you. Your student, the youngest child in the Enke family, has become a monk at St. Gregory's Abbey Monastery by the name of Brother Aardvark Dolphin Siegel. Brother Aardvark will be studying gardening and growing vegetables and fruit trees at the Abbey and will not be returning to Marble School or 2nd grade. Respectfully, Father Leo, Brother Peter, Brother Andrew, St. Gregory's Abbey, 3 Rivers, Michigan. And here, this is what Elliot made, that really awesome poster out of the bottom of this. This is the year 2000 again, but this is in 1973, so 2 years later. How old will I be? 35, then 36. I think there's a math issue there. What will I be? I don't know. Probably a teacher or a writer. A lot of things I wanted to be. I have been told it is impossible. Then there's the possibility of nuclear disaster and pollution and the greenhouse effect. Explanation of the greenhouse effect, which you could read in Dennis the Menace comic books at that time. People were talking about it a lot. The earth will heat up from all the pollution and everything will go extinct. So unless we stop polluting and building nuclear power and bombs, I don't think we will make it that far. And the comic underneath, there's a grown-up wearing a skirt saying, you can be anything. And there's a smaller child person who says, I want to be a frog. And the skirt-wearing person says, no, that's impossible. And the smaller person says, we're all going extinct anyway. These days, it would be hard to miss the trans in this work. Transgender, trans species, trans despair, hope, and connection. When I was growing up, most sources told me that trans people, and I did know they existed, were pathological, outside the scope of acceptable social worlds, and likely to be subjected to shock treatments if they dared publicly convey their sense of self. This is the purple animal. Animals can't be purple. We'll have a conference with your parents. Your animal doesn't seem to understand the difference between fairy tales and reality. Yes, officer. This is a lot of intentional misspelling, because I did this actually much older than it looks. Transsexuality was scary in other ways as well. Christine Jorgensen, icon of 1950s white transsexuality, became known again in the 1970s through notably justice-oriented university speaking tours. But as an 8-year-old, I feared that if Christine Jorgensen had, as many said, been turned into a woman, that is, if there were ways to turn someone into a woman, people in my world would forcibly turn me into a girl or woman, recognizing something about me that wasn't. Extinction wasn't a metaphor or something happening to species elsewhere. It was immediate and daily. Neither my parents nor feminism as it came to me were prepared to dismantle the weight of gender as genital or birth assignment. I experienced a feminism that encouraged boys to cry and girls to climb trees. A feminism that tried to empower girls struggling in a sexist, homophobic, racist world. I have some comment on that. Free to be you and me. I don't know if that's a familiar text for all of you, but it was a pretty big deal when it came out in the mid-70s. And qualifications: live on another planet, be believed, have a whole other school system. It was a feminism rallying around my supposed brave girlhood, but unable to consider that I was living a brave and not so brave boyhood. It was a feminism that rarely, if ever, stood up for the ways that boys might be girls and girls might be boys, or something else altogether. Starfish. I heard orange starfish can do anything purple starfish can do. Can you? No, they just say that to make us feel better. For example, it can't be a purple starfish. And going even farther, this is a Martian from Pluto on Earth saying, your planet is making my body fall apart. Jumping ahead to 2018, when my undergraduates listened to a recording of college administrators asking Christine Jorgensen about how to educate people around trans issues and reduce discrimination, a student marveled, wait, that was 1972? How can they have been having that conversation in 1972? And people are still acting like it's so radical and impossible to treat trans people like people, or like even believe us. Yet another student chimed in, I mean, they knew enough over 50 years ago to understand her as a woman and use her right pronouns. We've totally gone backwards on that, to where all these people, and even professors, are like, it's too hard, it's too confusing. The students aren't just talking about pronouns. They're talking about the astronomically high rate of violence and murder against trans people of color, and the ways people die for lack of health care. They're also talking about and enacting how queer communities sustain life in the face of death. Throughout the 60s and 70s, trans people were organizing. Some were feminists, including movers and shakers of the movement. In those years, most trans people received the dominant medical advice that if they were going to transition, they should erase their complexly gendered history and replace it with an autobiography told in one gender. Of those who survived, many took that advice, and some became cooks and entertainers and ministers and doctors and teachers and pipe fitters and feminist activists with single gender stories of their past and future. Then in the 1990s, they started to come out. We multiplied along with our narrated genders. Our stories grew more complex. And I've watched as cables to rage that were inadmissible 50 years ago became poetry today. Trans expressions that were invisible to adults in the 1970s, or always read through a lens of childhood sex-gender confusion, or the impacts of sexism, have become newly accessible, even if still mightily debated and brutally stigmatized in the 20th century. A past transgender childhood becomes relatable. But I want to suggest that resting with a transgender reading might not go far enough. This is an abstract, and at the top it says, "Do you come from the sky or the water? I don't know. Do you? No. Do you? No." That is to say, these marks are not simply coding transgender when there wasn't enough language for that. When read as allegories of gender, we miss so much. I'm seeing not just coded, but also extremely direct articulations of attachments to the land and its creatures, and also spiritual, if sometimes private, refusals to abide by the cognitive and institutional structures of contemporary society. And in this moment, I see younger generations also articulating refusals and alternatives. Their theory and practice is partly animated by contemporary queer, trans, disabled people of color and two-spirit people like Haunani K. Trask, Janet Mock, Eli Clare, Leanne Betasamasake Simpson, and others, who themselves draw heavily on a familiar list of feminist revolutionaries like Audre Lorde, Angela Davis, Gloria Anzaldúa, Beth Brandt, Jewel Gomez, the list goes on. But it's more than that. A practice of transformative recognition in the present requires that we hear more than the feminisms, more than the things that already make sense, more than what we assume we recognize. It includes teetering on the cusp of knowing and embracing not knowing. We have the history and the theory to understand the replication of systemic, calculated and uncalculated violences that shape our communities at every scale. As we face fascism and extinction, I return to the ways that in every gathering, humans and animals and plants and waterways are saying things outside the scope of agreed upon language. This might be where we find ourselves dismantling business as usual, creating alternatives to the replication of violence everywhere we are. It's vitally important that we honor the less scripted and less vetted cables, the stuttering, the awkward communications that don't fit the rules, the multiplicity, and that we listen even if we don't comprehend, even if we don't like or are threatened by what we hear, to allow the illegible to announce itself, to change our course of action, to suspend our plans, and to change who we are willing to be with each other. Thank you. I don't know how our time is, but I hope we have some time for Q&A, or I would love to hear your thoughts about things. How do we have?
Yeah, we have time. Questions?
Oh, hi, thank you so much. I enjoyed this so much, and I have a million questions, and I'm going to ask, like, maybe three of them. I'm interested in your archive as one of the most exciting parts of the talk to me. And what a rich collection of documents. And I'm thinking about Julian Gill Peterson's book, Histories of Transgender Childhood, which draws on the medical archive, especially from Johns Hopkins. So it just got me thinking about this archive and how is it different and what does it give us that a medical archive of trans childhoods can't or don't, if anything. And I was also wondering, are you proposing a genderqueer lens with which to analyze these documents, or is it something that is not necessarily attached to gender at all, or is your main investment kind of post-structural in the sense that you're breaking down deconstructing accepted categories? That's actually all.
That was only two.
Well, I'll ask you the rest at dinner.
Yeah, thank you so much for both of those questions. So in terms of archives, so I should clarify here that there are original pages in my graphic memoir that I did produce when I was in kindergarten and and on. The majority of the pages that are in that graphic memoir are modeled on that work that I did. So they're not literally like this, for example, is not literally pulled out of a box that that was produced at that time. And so in answer to your first question, when we think about like Peterson's work, that is using an archive of a certain set of source materials that themselves have already been kind of heavily vetted and curated according to medical logics, according to logics of race, according to logics of not just childhood, but also the malleability of humanness. They're coming from a very interested place, and it requires a lot of imagination, in fact, to tell a story using those documents. This is also a work of imagination. And so part of what I'm wanting to do, and this is part of transfeminist method that I'm exploring as thinking about transfeminist method, speaks a little bit to your second question, which is that though it has been acknowledged that history is a very imaginative art, we don't always acknowledge to what extent that is a very imaginative art, and that we bring so much creativity to these documents that we might find in archives, right? And so I don't want to say this is the same kind of archive as that archive, because it's definitely not. Most of these pages were generated within the last 5 years. It's a very different thing, and they're generated with my very contemporary lens and my very contemporarily interested take on what was going on in the 60s and 70s, especially with me and my family and the environment. So they are, I recognize, very, very much two different kinds of archives, but I really appreciate the question in that it does invite us to think about them together, and that work of imagination that I think we bring to all scholarship, right? And that being able to get into that imaginative aspect sometimes it's not just about making stuff up, it's about illuminating a potential that exists in those original documents. It's about making connection across time. Yeah. So I guess that's what I would say. And in terms of your second question, yeah, it's not that I want to see it through a genderqueer lens either. This is a trans story, but I want to see that it is more than that, because I think sometimes it's too easy to say this is spoken this way because this is a trans person, and what are we missing that they're saying because of that filter that we have just put on it. So it is partly wanting to get out of that as well.
I guess my question would be, first off, what the relationship was for you as you were reproducing the documents to the idea of the pressure for authenticity through how you were curating what you were reproducing. Because that's one thing that I see going through. I recently found documents from my own childhood, and there are some diagnostic things that I didn't know existed all the way back when I was 4 years old. So the particular relief of authenticity that I saw in this very old documentation, things that I was unclear about going through my life, there was just a real reification of, yes, that was real. But also thinking about you as an academic and listening to you have commentary while seeing these images. In monster theory is all about boundary violation for the relief of certain pressures. And so one of the pressures that I'm also seeing is that academic, who you can talk to as an academic, who can talk to yourself, and who you can talk to, including yourself, in these two languages. So I guess I would say, you can talk about authenticity and interior language a little bit.
Yeah, thanks so much for that. I'm gonna take a little bit the second one first, as a way of getting into the first one. When I first started doing this work, I was very, very protective of it and did not want it anywhere near the university. Partly because I was so much in process, and the process of sort of sorting through, I guess, partly issues of authenticity and voice and discovering what that was. And I really didn't want any kind of an academic imposition interfering with my process. Since that time, I have been showing a lot of this work to academic audiences, but in pretty carefully selected locations. Again, thank you very much. It really is an incredible opportunity. I wouldn't do it anywhere. That said, I have a lot of privilege as an academic. I feel like I have the luxury to explore these things that are a little bit outside the scope of what history tends to do. They're not necessarily so outside the scope of what gender and women's studies does, but to an extent. But the other thing that has really made it possible was, it has been over the last decade or two, the emergence of graphic work within academics, and so much more ability now to grant the validity of graphic work. Linda Berry is at UW, and people's lives have been saved because of her comics classes. And that's a really powerful thing, that this is a very powerful, powerful medium, and it's happening in academics, and I'm very grateful for it. And it's not just simply that it is saving lives, which might be about the most important thing, but it is allowing us to express things that actually can't be expressed in other mediums, right? So, so that's the relationship to academics. I still am pretty careful about it, though, because for so many reasons. The authenticity question, I really, really appreciate it. It's been a process. I have pages that I created in one moment and thought, this is it. And I come back to it 6 months later, and I'm like, that's so far off, and I totally need to redo this. And a year later, it's like, wow, that is really off. And then I'll go back to something I created when I was a little kid and realize it's actually maybe not that off at all. And what you were saying about sort of the confirmation of seeing your early work, that has been really, really important for me, because one of the voices, so in history, some of the marginalizing voices that we encounter doing queer scholarship, and back then lesbian scholarship, was you can't possibly have enough sources for this. This is a marginalizing way of responding to a person's interest in studying something in the past. We don't have evidence. With this work, it is true that there are certain things a kid would produce and articulate and certain things that they wouldn't, but it's been really amazing to me how often people will say, there's no way a kid could have been able to spell that word. Or there's no way a kid would have been able to write a story that goes on across months. Or there's no way that a kid would have been reading these books. Or kids don't draw bodies as symmetrically. Or kids can't write in a straight line across a piece of paper. And all of these things are kind of true, but they're also feeling really fascist to me, because in fact kids come in so many different ways, and they do so many different things, and we get help from different sources, and if it's important to a kid to write straight across the paper, he's gonna find a way to do it, right? Or wanting to, you know, be very messy with things. And so I have had to take many of those things into account, because there is, like some of the slides that I showed, the later anti-war, or the protest slides, were not done in grade school. I've had to take seriously some of those issues about development, and I've been very grateful that I've had a lot of my own work as reference, you know, and other people who can say, yeah, you were reading that book. Did you understand it? No, you know, but, you know, so it's a process. It's a very dynamic process. It's been fascinating to me to see it unfold. I have been very surprised at what's come up. And some of the pages are just totally wrong. So they will or will not be in there for many different reasons. Some of the pages that are just wrong are going to be there anyway. But yeah, it's a feel. It's like a feel for a thing. Yeah, thanks for that. Yes, please.
Hi, I had a question about monks. And I preface it to say that I currently work on the medieval period, and right now I'm working on transgender monks, both secular and secular representations. So it was really interesting to see your fascination with monks and the questions that sort of you, the grown-up you, and reflecting with a childhood you had this fascination about what differences it made if you count robes, and how many of them were always boys. Like, I think that's wonderful. And I'm just curious, since this is the grown-up you, what you think your fascination with monks was then and now. If you don't mind sharing.
Yeah, thanks for that. And I really want to find out what you're finding. That sounds so fascinating. Yeah, so I look forward to seeing what comes of that. I certainly didn't know there were any monks that did that when I was a kid, and this was one area where this was a line that could not be crossed, right? So you can be anything, and by the time you're grown up, a woman will be president and all of that, and you can be a nun. So, I mean, it was just increasingly clear to me that this was a path that was not going to be available to me. I think my fascination, I was always a really mystically oriented kid. And we would go to this abbey, and they had gardens, and it was beautiful, and it was peaceful, and the main sanctuary smelled to me like dune grass and wood, and like all this really cool stuff. And then I think I also, you know, the gender of that place is an interesting one. And I think it's one that I could connect to, and really sort of see myself in. It's these, you know, guys, and they've got their beards, but they're very gentle, and, you know, it just, so, I mean, I think that all of those things were part of it. And that is sort of the path that was not taken. And so it's a path that continues to be very near to me. There are a lot of reasons why that probably won't become my path. I wouldn't want to rule it out. But there were a lot of reasons why that would not, even if it had been accessible or available to me, why I think I wouldn't have ended up there anyway. There's a lot of rules, for one thing, you know. And I remember being at one point, so I had the Abbey schedule, and between 2nd and 3rd grade, I decided I was going to follow the Abbey schedule, you know, and like get up and do the prayers and do that. And I didn't know what they were. Like, I didn't know what I was supposed to be doing when I got up to do matins. But you know, I thought at a certain point, one thing that happened was I came into a conflict because Vespers, this thing that's supposed to happen in the evening, I'm supposed to be doing this prayer thing and like come in and pray with all the monks, or, you know, in my imagination, I'm going to do that. But actually, there's this really amazing thing happening outside, and it's this bird, and it's interacting with this other bird, and there's like bugs watching it and stuff. And I'm like, wait a minute, I'm supposed to be doing Vespers, but there's this really, really incredibly important thing that I have to witness. So what do I do? And what's the, like, what is it the rule that I'm supposed to be at Vespers, or is the rule that I'm supposed to witness this miraculous thing unfolding before me all the time? And so I think I started really thinking about monasteries as places where I would have maybe had to conform a little more than is in my nature. So, I don't know, thank you for your question, and I really am interested in your work.
Time for one last question, anybody? Sorry, go ahead.
I guess this is like less of a question and more of a comment slash question, but I'm in like a gender studies course right now, and then also like an environmental sociology course right now, and some friends that are in both with me have been talking a lot about like the intersection between like social movements that involve the environment and social movements that involve gender and sexuality and all those different things. And I just really appreciated like in the work that we got to see today, like that we saw the intersection of that a lot, and that like we were able to see that those things overlap. Like for example, like what's on the screen right now, like thinking about things like gender and sexuality and also the earth, and that like social movements don't just have to regard like things, they can regard like all sorts of different things.
Yeah.
And so like was that always like a part of the process for you in thinking about like defining yourself and defining like this transfeminist movement, thinking about the earth as well, or is that like more of a recent thing, or how did that develop for you?
First off, thanks so much for your comments, and I feel like those would just be beautiful concluding comments, and we could all just go. But taking your question, that connectedness to environment has been so integral to who I am that like, I mean, I can't really imagine not being that way, and my sense of yeah, you know, everything. And so I mean, I can't separate these things out. I have not always brought environmental things into my academic work. And I think that's partly also because it has been maybe a little bit too intensely experienced for me. A little, yeah, so just, it's along with this, something that I have wanted to be a little bit protective of. So yeah, I'm really glad that people are doing that work, and that work has also made more room for my work in those areas, and it's made it more possible for my work in doing that to be more comprehensible to people. So yeah, thank you for recognizing that, and also for your comments. Appreciate it.
Thank you for really moving and really